In this video, I'm going to take you guys along as I try to build one of the best gaming PCs you can assemble for around about $1,600. A build that prioritizes both aesthetics and performance to create a system that provides great frame rates at 1080p and 1440p in all of the latest titles, while also looking the part too, with a case I'm really excited to build in and may have had just a little bit of experience with before. As always, I'm going to run you guys through all the parts that make this build possible, why I've chosen the components I have, and of course the build process from the very start to the very finish. Let's do this. The Corsair Titan series is here. Corsair's latest lineup of 240mm, 280mm and 360mm of coolers feature Corsair's new flow drive cooling engine with a 3-phase pump for higher flow rates, higher efficiency and better cooling. Cap swap compatibility allows you to change the top plate of your cooler, while IQ Link support and magnetic dome RX fans round off a design that's ready to keep your CPU cool under pressure. Check out the range at the first link below. I'm going to start by running through all the components that make this build possible and why I've made particular choices that I have. Now let's start off, shall we, with the graphics card, the RTX 4070 Super. Now this particular version comes in from MSI, and this remains one of the most popular GPUs on the market right now. Now typically for around about a $600 price point, which is what you'll pay for the 4070 Super, I'd be inclined to recommend the 7900 GRE, or heck, even start thinking about the RX 7900 XT. However, if you look at your guys' purchasing data and what you guys are actually going out to buy, this card tops the list every time. Compared to the original 4070 non-super, it brings with it a bit more power, and that's actually really quite useful, and Nvidia did so without raising the price of this card versus the non-super GPU that it iterates upon. Now this MSI card is a stunning all-white design. It's their Gaming X Slim, so as well as being white in colour, it's actually fairly compact in its form factor, and if I open it up, you'll see, look at that. That has to be one of the best looking GPUs I think I've seen in a long time. Now the 4070 Super is well equipped for things like DLSS and ray tracing, again, something not everyone is going to use, but still offers up great rasterization performance, and the 12GB of GDDR6X video memory is enough for 1080p and 1440p gaming. Yes, if you're getting into 4K, your textures are going to start to struggle. It's not really the card you want to buy, but for 1440p, 12GB is enough. Nvidia have dropped the ball when it comes to VRAM on other cards. This isn't one of those instances. As far as the CPU goes, I'm actually going to say that you guys have got a little bit of choice as to what you opt for in this build. Now this is what I would be inclined to go for the most. It's the Ryzen 5 9600X, and I'm recommending it on the basis I think its price is going to start to fall in the next few weeks and months. I mean, heck, we've got Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and of course the Xmas holiday period coming up. However, in its current state, the 9600X isn't the sensible buy. Instead, the last generation 7600X is what you want to go for instead. This does offer slightly more performance, better power efficiency, but it's more expensive, and too much more expensive in the current landscape. For a more higher all-core workload, you might want to look at chips like the Ryzen 7 7700X or the new 9700X. Again, that's the same kind of situation. The new 9700 is the better CPU, more power efficient, more cores. However, it's, well, plainly too expensive. I'll leave latest pricing for everything though down in the description below. As far as the motherboard is concerned in this build, I've gone X870, which might seem like a weird decision, but again, hear me out, because this is MSI's brand new Pro X870p Wi-Fi, and it's one of the most affordable X870 motherboards currently on the market. Now, whether you go for last gen Ryzen or new gen Ryzen doesn't really make much of a difference, but what this board does do is brings you some of those newer features like USB 4 and better support for things like Gen 5 NVMe's and GPUs as standard to a board at this price point. This build is intended to be fairly white themed, so these silver accents are going to match really nicely with the rest of the components. If you want to save some money, B650 is worth considering. This though, at around $200 with a rebate, isn't going to cost you really that much more than a B650 board, and it's going to give you the better connection and more up-to-date features, which is why I've opted to go for it in this system. As far as RAM is concerned, I've gone for this G.Skill Z5 Neo kit. Now this particular kit is actually a white and black set, so it's kind of like a panda aesthetic, which again is going to match the case and some of the other parts I've picked absolutely perfectly. I love what G.Skill have been doing with some of their kits, and this one is no exception. I'd love to see a fully all-white design. I think that would actually go well in lots of builds, but from the top profile you can see it really is very nice. You've got the RGB, which is split by this cool kind of wavy heat spreader. Not the lowest clearance kits on the market, but they're also not particularly huge either. SSD wise, I'm actually going to give you guys two choices. Now if you want to leverage Gen 5 NVMe's, MSI did kind of send out their M580 Frozer. Now this is a really super high-end Gen NVMe. These are going to become more and more widespread. We're expecting to see these without the massive heatsinks eventually. In the meantime, if you're more price conscious, you'll want to go for this instead, the MP44L from TeamGroup, and speed-wise is still going to be more than adequate. First port of call is installing the processor, so I'm going to lift up the arm on the CPU socket and drop the CPU into place. Nice and simple. RAM is then going to be the next port of call. I'll be using the 2nd and 4th DIMM slots in the build today. Really good because it's going to give plenty of room for upgrades. As we've seen in all of our testing, 32 gigabytes is the perfect amount. Anything more is overkill as it stands at the moment, but 16 gigs is just going to cause you bottlenecks in lots of games, and that is something you really want to avoid. NVMe drive is going to be next up. Fully toolless on this board, so although it's pretty bare bones as far as X870 goes, it's still going to allow for fairly easy installation of the M.2 drive, which is good. And it looks like, does this use, yep, MSI's pretty standard at this point, toolless NVMe installation. So that just clips over like that. Remember to remove this protective shielding on the actual M.2 thermal pad. The cover is just going to slip back on, and that's going to keep the drive nice and cool as well, which is always beneficial. I always say at this stage that before finishing the motherboard assembly, it's a good job to check out the CPU cooler. Now this is the MSI i360 in white. This looks really great in my opinion. Again, in our testing, it's held up really well, even better than their recent E360, which I was actually a pretty big fan of. Now this has got quite a cool sort of polygon CPU water block design, as well as a trio of 120mm ARGB fans, which I may use in this build. I may end up swapping them out for some aftermarket fans. That will be decided a little bit later once everything is in the case. Always a good idea to open up the cooler at this stage, just to assess the mounting hardware and just get the whole thing unboxed really. Now you can see the cooler comes with the fans pre-installed, which is always a good start. 320mm units here. You get this nice polygon sort of inspired RGB water block, and as you can see here, MSI actually put a little plastic clip down the side to hide the side profile of the fans, which I think is actually a fairly good budget way of making the cooler look a bit better. You also get this really nice tray of included mounting hardware, and that makes the whole thing a lot easier to understand. So you can see actually what happens to have fallen out are actually the AMD standoffs, which I'll be using in this build, and the associated thumb screws, which I'm going to be using to actually fasten the cooler into place. Now these AMD standoffs are actually going to go in the motherboard and replace the existing black plastic mounting hardware. That means that needs removing, and these standoffs need adding in. Now once this is done, the next port of call is, like normal, to move the motherboard over into the case. And let me show you what I've picked up for this build. Now this right here is the MSI Pano 100L PZ. Now this is one of MSI's latest cases, and as a brand that's not really known for making PC cases, it would be easy to be skeptical about this design. But when I looked at the black version, I was actually really impressed. And this white one, straight off the bat, already looks amazing. Now there's a few key features I really like about this case. For example, the really easy vertical GPU support bracket that clicks in and clicks out of the case in one of the easiest and most simple ways I've ever seen. I mean, it doesn't get any easier than that. All the side panels are toolless as well, so you can take off the glass panel with no issue. The top panel's got captive thumb screws, so once that's unscrewed, that's going to pop off no problems too. Once that's off, it reveals a case that feels really solid and really well built, with a chassis that supports, of course, all those back to front motherboards with a standard ATX layout, as well as plenty of room for fans and radiators at the top, the bottom, and even over here on the side. Now what I'm going to do to kick things off is just slide the motherboard in, and it couldn't really be any easier in this case, as all you've got to do is just line the motherboard up over the ATX standoffs and just drop it into place. All the screws you need to actually secure this down come included with the case. As I say, 3 at the top, 3 along the middle, and 3 down the bottom to stop the board from going anywhere. Once the board is in, it's then time for the radiator. I'm going to go ahead and pop the AIO at the top in this build. This is going to provide good cooling for the CPU and natural exhaust through the chassis as well, giving us some nice exhaust fans to play with. Just got to get a couple of the screws seated on this top rail, and once you've got 1 or 2 screws in, you're going to be pretty much halfway there. That'll just hold it into place while you go ahead and finish the rest. I'm then going to drop a dab of thermal paste onto the Ryzen processor and then drop the cooler on. The only thing I don't like about this MSI i360 is that the water block isn't actually rotatable, and what that means is the MSI logo is going to end up the wrong way round if you're not careful and you don't plan the build out well. Ideally, I'd rather the tubes were on the right hand side than the bottom, but I haven't really got much of a choice on the basis I can't actually really configure it. So that's looking pretty good, but I'm also going to add in the remainder of the fans at this point, which are a set of Corsair's RX fans. I'm going to add in a 120mm to the rear, 320mm to the side as intake, and a further 320mm to the bottom, also in an intake configuration. These fans don't look too bad when they're sort of back back to front. There are nicer designs out there. You can get dedicated reverse ones, but I think these are going to look pretty good in the build today and provide great RGB control too. The next step is going to be the power supply, and I'd originally intended to use Cooler Master's GX3 750 Gold. However, I started planning some of the parts of my next build, which is kind of a Cooler Master system, so I figured I might save this for that instead. If you want to go even more MSI, then you could go for this, the A750GL. This is actually slightly cheaper than the Cooler Master unit, and I've had some really good experiences using it in a range of builds. As far as cables go, you're going to want to plug in a 24-pin motherboard power cable. That goes down here to the bottom of the PSU. Also want to connect up the PCI Gen 5 cable. This has got the nice little yellow ends, so you can easily tell whether or not the cable is properly in. Also going to pop in a CPU power connector at this stage. So one down here on the right-hand side of the power supply, and then a second 8-pin power cable just above, before finally adding a SATA power cable in. We may need this for things like RGB. I actually think these Corsair fans use the old 6-pin PCI power, so I'm also going to pop one of those into the power supply for the fans. Then just a case of getting that screwed into the rear. Cables, I'm going to run these for now, but I'm going to buy some white cable extensions just to hide the black cables basically and try and make the whole thing match a little bit better before also connecting up all the front panel cables such as the JFP1, HD audio and various USB headers too. The final stage then is the GPU installation, and for this I'm really easily going to pull out this MSI vertical GPU bracket and just take the opportunity to pull out a couple of the PCI lanes, and these are the ones I'm going to be installing the graphics card into. Now I like that MSI give you a lot of choice here. I think I'm going to prioritise maybe the middle mount, as that's still going to give me a nice aesthetic but also allow room for airflow at the front of the card, hopefully keep a lid on temperatures. So I'm just going to remove these two brackets, then add the PCI riser cable on, before then sliding this whole assembly into place. Now you can see getting the actual PCIe riser cable installed is a bit of a challenge. Just to give you guys a little bit of a close-up, you can see how that sits in there, and you just want to make sure that the PCI latch is fully closed and holding the riser into place. Before then pushing the final assembly in, getting it clipped into place. I said this in my last Pano build that I did in this case, stop the graphics card wobble too, but I really like this system from MSI, and it's something that I think a lot of the bigger case brands would do well to try and replicate. Now that is pretty much the build. All that remains really, once the GPU stopped wobbling, is to get the power cable into the top of the graphics card and change those PSU extensions out for white a little bit later, before popping all the panels on, booting this machine up and seeing just how well it really performs. Into performance, which is of course the important bit, and as usual I've tested this build in a wide variety of titles. Today using the MSI 321URX monitor, which has a gorgeous QD OLED panel. To see exactly how the whole system stacks up, it started off with Cyberpunk 2077 first of all, and at 1440p high settings with DLSS on the quality preset, frame generation enabled and ray tracing on and set to medium, the build did really well over the 100 FPS mark with 121 frames per second on average, and if I do say so myself, a really fantastic visual experience with that ray tracing tech enabled. Move through into a game though where rasterization is key, something like Apex Legends, where you want high frame rates with no DLSS or frame generation to speak of, and here at 1440p high, the results were still really good. 266 FPS on average in our test of Apex. Star Wars Outlaws did well too at 1440p high, DLSS on the quality preset once again, and ray tracing set to high for good measure, and here the build pulled in just shy of 150 FPS with 148 frames on average to be precise. Fortnite at 1080p competitive performed really well too. This actually did less frames than what we saw in Apex at 1440p, but still did really well with 245 FPS on average. Call of Duty's Warzone at 1440p high also performed pretty well on this build, well over that 100 FPS mark, nearer to 150 with 144 frames per second on average. Hogwarts Legacy is another tricky game to run and one that really tests the mettle of any build. Here at 1440p high, the system did well well with 104 FPS on average to be precise. 2 more games to go, the first of which is Alan Wake 2, 1440p high settings, DLSS on quality, frame gen and ray tracing enabled. Why are we testing all this stuff? Well, it's an NVIDIA based build and these are the advantages you're going to get by spending that bit more, and the result was fantastic, over 100 FPS on average all told. Finally, Black Myth Wukong wraps up the benchmarks today, 1440p high settings, DLSS on the quality preset, frame gen once again enabled and ray tracing turned on for good measure, and we saw the lowest frame rate of any test today, but still really strong with 92 FPS on average. This then a build that performs really well, but what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. You can find links with up-to-date part pricing in the description too. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.